Today we're discussing my top 24 Dynasty wide receivers. There is going to be some disagreement from time to time, so if you disagree with something, let me know below in the comment section and let me know why. Some things that I really prioritize are QB situation, maximum upside, youth, floor, and consistency. Obviously, there's other factors such as how the wide receiver wins, their total volume. That's also something I pay attention to. And so I'm going to explain a lot of these things with each of these wide receivers and why I think a certain wide receiver should be here versus here or in this tier versus another. So if you disagree, just let me know below in the comment section and let me know why. With that being said, the first wide receiver we have is Ja'Marr Chase. He's the only wide receiver, in my opinion, in general, besides maybe Amari Cooper. I'm not sure at this stage of his career, honestly, though, that's really at least capable of even posting a 50-point fantasy game for us, at least in a full PPR setting. His quarterback, Joe Burrow, has definitely had some injury issues, and so that's kind of capped his ceiling, and he's had little tweaks here and there, but he presents, in my opinion, the highest weekly upside of any wide receiver in the NFL. Now, another thing is he's been the wide receiver 12 or better in 6 of the first 11 weeks. That is fantastic. Another reason to like Ja'Marr Chase is that he's only 24 years and 7 months old, so historically, the age apex of wide receiver production is 26. So at least historically, he's not even at his peak yet in terms of production and capabilities, which is terrifying if you don't own him in any league, really. I mean, when we think about how he's performed over the first couple of seasons of his career, he's been the wide receiver 5, 12, 11, and currently he's the wide receiver 1. Now, QB play in terms of when Burrow's out and then a couple nicks here and there can explain why in years 2 and 3 he wasn't a little bit higher, but to have in your first 3 full seasons wide receiver 12 overall be your floor is pretty good. When we think about how he's performing in real life, he plays 34.8% of his snaps from the slot and 63% out wide. I like wide receivers that can in general be used all over the field, so I do like that utilization. It helps make it so that you can, at least at some points in the game, avoid facing the top cover corner, which is obviously good for fantasy production. His 2.39 yards per out run rank 13th among 107 total wide receivers with 19 plus targets. His 6.7 yards after catch per reception is 15th. His PFF receiving grade of 81 is 19th. His missed tackles forced of 13 is 4th among the sample size. His 6 contested catches are tied for 35th. His 97 total targets are 3rd. His 73 receptions are 1st. His 1,056 receiving yards are 1st. And his 12 touchdowns are 1st. And so, yeah, he's 1st in all but targets in terms of raw production. And so it's pretty easy to say as to why he's my wide receiver 1. He's young. He's connected to a good quarterback. He has a ton of upside. His floor isn't the best out of the elite tier of wide receivers, but it's still pretty solid. He is a high target volume hog. And yeah, he hasn't even remotely reached his prime yet, at least historically. So Ja'Marr Chase is my wide receiver 1. My dynasty wide receiver 2 is Justin Jefferson of the Minnesota Vikings. He's 25 years and 4 months old, so still, just like with Ja'Marr Chase, he likely, at least historically, has not reached his apex in terms of total production. When we think about it, at the current moment in time, he has Sam Darnold, but then they also drafted J.J. McCarthy. Now, he is a bit of an unknown, but what I will say about Jay Jettas is, in general, at least in my opinion, he is the most QB-proof wide receiver that there is. He's basically a good bet for around 20 fantasy points in a full PPR, regardless as to who's throwing to him. He's connected to an offensive-minded head coach in KOC, and so I really like that. He's the clear number 1 on his own team. He doesn't have the upside of Ja'Marr Chase, at least he hasn't yet. He's had quite a few 30-point games, but not quite the 50-point range, and that's something that I think differentiates Ja'Marr Chase from Jay Jettas, but the floor for Jay Jettas in general is a little bit higher. So in my opinion, between the two of them, it is a little bit of preference. And so between the two of them, I do give the edge to Ja'Marr Chase because I really value the maximum output of points that you're capable of producing. but it's really, really close. When we think about Jay Jettis' performance this season, he has been a wide receiver 12 or better in 5 of the first 11 weeks, with one wide receiver 13 overall finish. So just like Ja'Marr Chase, a very high-end asset in terms of maximum output, but just a little bit worse than Chase in that regard. Chase had 6 of such games. But when we think about Jay Jettis historically, he's been the wide receiver 6, 4, 1, 33, although that was only in 10 games. And then currently he's the wide receiver 3. So once again, I definitely can understand the conceptualization that consistency could be a little bit better because he's more likely to get you a certain amount of points than Chase is, but I still prefer the upside. But just like with Ja'Marr Chase, Jay Jettis is used all over the formation. He has 29.2% of his snaps from the slot, 69.7% out wide. He has 2.75 yards per out run, which is 5th in the entire NFL, which is very impressive considering he has Sam Darnold, who's been serviceable, but definitely nothing special. His PFF receiving grade of 86 is 8th in the entire NFL. However, his yards after catch per reception of 4.1 is tied for 51st. He's more so, the kind of wide receiver that gets really open, but he's not the best after the catch, but he's fine. But fantasy points are fantasy points. We don't really care how you get them per se. It's just, do you? Then his missed tackles forced of 4 is tied for 38th. Same thing with yards after catch per reception. Then he has 9 contested catches, which is tied for 12th, 86 targets, which is 6th, 59 receptions, which is 8th, 912 yards, which is 2nd, and 5 touchdowns, which is tied for 8th. Overall, I definitely think that Jay Jettis deserves to absolutely be in the conversation for wide receiver 1 overall. I would just slightly give the nod to Chase, but Justin Jefferson is absolutely a force to be reckoned with and one of the most consistent assets in fantasy football. My dynasty wide receiver 3 is CeeDee Lamb of the Dallas Cowboys. He's 25 years and 6 months old, so still under the age apex of 26. And even though he's slightly older than the previous 2, it's really not anything to be concerned about. In general, I don't really care too much about the difference in age if it's, under 3 years really. But the thing about him is he doesn't have the maximum upside of Ja'Marr Chase. And in my opinion, and statistically, at least this season, he is a little bit less consistent than Justin Jefferson. And so that lands him at wide receiver 3, which you're really splitting hairs, in my opinion, between the 3 of them. If you gave me a 2nd round pick, I would probably trade Lamb for Justin Jefferson or Justin Jefferson for Lamb. At this point, with Ja'Marr Chase distinguishing himself this year, I don't know if I would do that per se. But yeah, he does have the highest output season of any of these guys. It's just that he's only had 2 weeks so far this year inside the top 12. And so at least at this current moment in time, he isn't really having the season that he did this past year. Plus, Dak Prescott's hurt, but we do like that he has Dak Prescott for the long term. When we think about how CeeDee Lamb has performed from year to year, until this year, because it's hard to repeat as the wide receiver 1, he had steadily been rising and been on an upward trajectory, which is something we all really like to see. He was the wide receiver 22, then 19, 5, 1, and he's currently the wide receiver 4. And so, yeah, you really want to see somebody get progressively better. It's good to see that they can continually raise their ceiling. Now, I would attribute a little bit of his situation right now due to Dak Prescott being out and it being really hard to have over 400 fantasy points in any given year. I mean, that is historic. But the one other thing, though, about him is that he is a little bit more of a slot receiver than the other 2, although he can definitely win from the X and the Z. So it's not really a thing of he's just a slot wide receiver, but that is something to note. He plays 54.1% of his snaps from the slot and 44.2% from out wide. His 2.05 yards per out run is 26th among the sample size. His PFF receiving grade of 76 is 30th. His yards after catch per reception of 4.9 is 31st. He is very good at yards after catch, so that is a little bit interesting to see. However, you can see that his missed tackles forced of 11 is tied for 5th, which is some proof that he's really good after the catch. His 13 contested catches are tied for 4th. His 102 targets are tied for 2nd. His 67 receptions are 3rd. His 774 receiving yards are 3rd. And his 4 touchdowns are tied for 16th. And so, in my opinion, he's just a tick behind Justin Jefferson in terms of he's not quite as consistent on a per game basis. And then he's also behind Jamar Chase, in my opinion, because the maximum upside of Chase really is unmatched. My dynasty wide receiver 4 is Malik Nabers of the New York Giants. So he's 21 years and 3 months old, so really, really young. That was one big pro in terms of him as a prospect, was that he was producing at such a young age. Now, in weeks 2 through 4, he was the wide receiver 6 or better in each of those weeks. He has cooled off a little bit after he missed some time with a concussion, but he is still by far and away, in my opinion, the best rookie wide receiver in the NFL. His situation is terrible, and yet he has still had some massive weeks. I do think even with Tommy DeVito going to start a couple games and potentially even Drew Lock at some point, that this season is going to be a little bit choppy. But look, there is no way they roll into next season without either A, drafting a quarterback, or B, signing one, or potentially both. And so since he's been producing in a horrific situation, and he is a massive target hog, by the way, that is one reason why I have him with these tier of wide receivers. Because in my opinion, by the time he's 24 years old, I think he's going to be producing exactly like the 3 wide receivers ahead of him are. And another thing, I don't think we've seen anything remotely close to his maximum upside. He, in my opinion, is a Jamar Chase-like player. And if you can get him in any league because people are worried about his QB situation, or if you can buy low on him, do it. This guy is supremely talented. One really cool stat about Malik Nabers is ESPN's open score gives him a 99. That is the probability that any given time you are going to be able to complete the pass to him because of his ability. The next closest player is Josh Downs at 89. That is how much better Malik Nabers is at separating. This guy is a ridiculous separator. Now, he's currently the wide receiver 13 in a full PPR, but he's only played 7 games. He missed some time due to a concussion, and he also had his bye week. And so that is deflating his current finish in terms of the standings. And I do think better days are ahead. He has some really soft matchups that I think he's going to be able to exploit. But like I said, after a red hot start to the season, post-concussion, he's come down to earth a little bit. But if his floor is, about 10 points, that is pretty good. I mean, he has scored more in every game than CeeDee Lamb has in his worst game. And yeah, I love Malik Nabers. When we think about how he's utilized, I really like that he's more outside than the slot, but I like that he can be used in both. And he's actually a little bit better in the slot. He plays 24.1% of his snaps from the slot and 75.3% out wide. His 2.03 yards per out run is 28th, so not the best, but his quarterback play is a part of that for sure. His 82 PFF receiving grade is 14th in the entire sample size of 107. His yards after catch per reception of 3.3 is tied for 76th. He, just like CeeDee Lamb, is really good after the catch. And so I think scheming and defensive attention, his 6 missed tackles forced is tied for 25th. His 12 contested catches are 6th. His 91 targets are 4th. His 61 receptions are tied for 5th. His 607 receiving yards are 19th. And his 3 touchdowns are tied for 33rd. But remember that he's only played 8 games. So all of the targets, receptions, yards, and touchdowns would probably be a little bit better and closer to the leaders of the entire NFL here if he had been able to play all those games, which he didn't. So I can't say that for sure, but for a rookie, he is tearing it up. It isn't the Justin Jefferson, Puka Nacua type of rookie season, but he's also in just about the worst situation imaginable. And he's still doing this. This guy has sky-high potential, and in my opinion, is going to be a Jamar Chase type of player that gives you a very solid floor, but with a ridiculous ceiling on a week-to-week basis as soon as he gets mediocre quarterback play. My dynasty wide receiver 5 is ASRB of the Detroit Lions. He's 25 years old, so still under the age apex of 26, and he's been a wide receiver 1 in terms of finishing 1 through 12 in 6 of the 11 games. The one thing about him is his QB situation is great with Jared Goff. He is the number 1 target. We like that. His floor is very, very good. In general, he's one of the best bets to for sure get you 10 guaranteed points out of anybody. Although this season he's had two such occurrences, whereas this past year he only had one total the entire season. The thing about him, though, is, and it's funny I'm saying this after he posts a 38-point week, but in general, he really doesn't most weeks have the tremendous upside, but it's more like Justin Jefferson in the sense of he's generally going to get you a very solid amount of points just about every week. And that's incredibly valuable. I just don't think the ceiling in general on a week-to-week basis is what Nabers, Jefferson, Chase, or Lamb really possess, but he's a fantastic player to own. And if you like consistency, if you value that a little bit more than upside, you'd probably have him a little bit higher. Another thing that I forgot to mention in terms of valuations here is I value what other people think in terms of the trade value of said player a lot too. And so that's going to play a part specifically with Nabers. It'll play a part with Harrison and some of these other rookie wide receivers because people really want the rookies. They really value youth. Obviously, I do too, immensely. But yeah, the community valuation is going to play a part here because it's important to be able to get off of players if need be for whatever reason, such as you just need more depth, so you want to tier down. Or if you are looking to tier up, maybe somebody else has a different valuation than you. But yeah, that is a factor here as well. When we think about ASRB, though, he, just like with CeeDee Lamb, until for Lamb this current season, is on an upward trajectory every single year, and that's something we like. He finished as the wide receiver 21 his rookie season, then 7, 3rd, and he's currently 2nd. And so we like the upward trajectory. Now, he, just like CeeDee Lamb, is a little bit more of a slot receiver, but just like with Lamb, it's not like he can't win outside. He plays 52% of his snaps from the slot and 47.7% out wide. His 2.4 yards per out run are tied for 11th. His 89.7 PFF receiving grade is 4th. His yards after catch per reception of 3.4 is tied for 72nd. It is a little bit lower, and he's not really the best yards after catch guy, but he can definitely get it done. His 8 missed tackles forced is tied for 12th. His 14 contested catches are 3rd. His 77 targets are 10th. His 65 receptions are 4th. His 685 receiving yards are 11th, and his 9 touchdowns are 2nd. And so you have, in my opinion, with ASRB, a slightly lesser version of Justin Jefferson in the sense of his fantasy output, but not that much of a difference really. And with them being relatively the same age, I really view them somewhat similarly. And obviously I have all these guys in the same tier, but with him being a little bit older than Nabers and with the maximum upside that I really think Nabers has and some of the high output games he had earlier, as well as the ceiling of Chase, the a little bit higher upside of Justin Jefferson, and then the higher upside, at least from what we've seen, of CeeDee Lamb, I do think I have him as a wide receiver 5, and I'm pretty firm about that. And so I value him relatively similarly. And like I said, with most of these guys, if you gave me a 2nd round pick on top of a 1-for-1 swap, I would probably do it. And so my wide receiver 6 and the final player in this tier is Nico Collins of the Houston Texans. So he's 25 years and 6 months old, so slightly under the age apex of 26. He is one of those really high upside players, but he's definitely dealt with his fair share of injuries, which is slightly lowering him compared to some of these other guys, in my opinion. But he does have a fantastic QB situation with CJ Stroud. He is the clear number 1 dominant target earner in the offense. And he's had some injuries this season. He's missed a lot of time with the hammy, but he had 2 top 5 wide receiver weeks before the injury. And then this past week, he should have had a massive game, but he had about an 80-yard touchdown called back. And so he has a ton of weekly upside that I would put at roughly that of Justin Jefferson and CeeDee Lamb. We just haven't seen as much of it, and he's dealt with some injuries the past 2 seasons. So I would just leave him a tick below some of these other guys, but really, really close. Another thing, just like with some of these other guys, is that he is on an upward trajectory. Now, his first season, he was the wide receiver 86, then 77, but this past year, he was the wide receiver 12, despite only playing in 15 games. And we saw some massive upside from him. Not Jamar Chase-like, but CeeDee Lamb or Justin Jefferson type of upside. And this year, before the hammy injury, he was looking like a realistic candidate to be the wide receiver 1 this year. And so when you think about him being under 26 with this level of elite play, it's definitely understandable if you have him a little bit higher in these rankings. And so I do think that due to him being a little bit older than some of these other guys, but at the same time also missing some time with injury, that is going to put him a little bit behind the ball here. But still a tier 1 wide receiver, in my opinion. He plays 19.5% of his snaps from the slot and 80% out wide. So more of your traditional dominant X wide receiver. His 3.39 yards per out run are first, and by a good margin, by the way. His 92.6 receiving grade is first. His 6.4 yards after catch per reception is tied for 20th. His 7 total missed tackles forced is tied for 20th, which when you think about the quantity of games in which he's played, he's only played a total of 6, and this past week he played about 50% of the snaps, 47% to be specific, and then he only played 13% the week that he had the injury in Buffalo. And so that's crazy. His 3 contested catches are tied for 61st. His 51 targets are 44th. His 36 receptions are tied for 36th. However, his 621 receiving yards are 16th. And that's despite missing basically half the season so far. Ridiculous. And his 3 touchdowns are tied for 33rd. So this guy is somebody that's connected to a young quarterback. He's still slightly below the age apex of 26. He has a very high ceiling, a pretty good floor as well. It's just he hasn't been doing it quite as long, and he's definitely had some injuries. And so that is going to play a factor here, but I still think that he's a tier 1 wide receiver and definitely somebody that you want on your fantasy football team. My Dynasty wide receiver 7 is Drake London of the Atlanta Falcons. So despite going into his 3rd season, he's only 23 years and 3 months old, so really, really young. That's one big factor here. But the other thing is, now that he finally has adequate quarterback play, he not only has Kirk Cousins, he also has Michael Penix, should anything happen to Cousins. And so that is an extra level of security in terms of somebody being able to actually get him the ball. And now he's only had 3 weeks inside the top 12 in terms of wide receiver weeks this season. And so that is what distinguishes him, in my opinion, from being a tier 1 wide receiver. And that's why I have him as a tier 2. The lack of total upside week so far is going to be that factor here. Now, most of the wide receivers we talked about before were on an upward trajectory from year to year. Now, I will definitely cut him a break. I mean, he was dealing with worse than 32nd best quarterback play and Arthur Smith. So I will definitely cut him some slack. After wide receiver 31 finish in his first year, he finished as the wide receiver 37 this past season. So a decrease there. The total output was relatively the same, but he also did that in one less game in his second season. So I do think he would have finished with more points, obviously, if he had played 17 games. And so far, he's the wide receiver 6 this year. He's had a couple really good weeks, but the consistency isn't there, and the floor is a little bit lower than most of these guys ahead of him. Now, one thing I really like is that they're using him a little bit more in the slot. In Arthur Smith's offense, he was a lot of times isolated by himself as an X wide receiver, and he's definitely good at that. But I really like them trying to work their matchups by moving him in the slot some. And so this year he's played 39.9% of his snaps from the slot, 59.8% out wide. His 2.02 yards per out run is 29th. His 83.0 PFF receiving grade is tied for 12th. Now, he's not really a yards after catch guy. His 2.8 yards after catch per reception are 87th. He, just like Justin Jefferson, is more so you get open and get the ball. He's a little bit different. Justin Jefferson is more of a finesse player, where Drake London is more of a physically dominant player. But they separate in different ways, but it's still the same type of receiver in the sense of the yards after catch aspect. I would give the edge to Jefferson, though, a little bit. His 8 missed tackles forced is tied for 12th. His 15 contested catches, though, are second. So once again, a big dominant target. His 88 targets are 5th. His 61 receptions are tied for 5th. His 710 receiving yards are 9th. And his 6 touchdowns are tied for 3rd. And so I really think we're starting to see more of what Drake London can be. It's just, can he be more consistent and raise his floor? Because he's a really talented player, and he does project to be the number one target on his team with reasonably good expectations for decent quarterback play with Penix waiting after Cousins. It's just, will he increase his floor and be a little bit more consistent? Time will tell, but that's why I have him at the top of tier 2. My Dynasty wide receiver 8 is MHJ. So he's only 22 years and 2 months old, so still pretty young, right? Really young, obviously. His ranking here has a lot to do with community valuation. He is a big name player that, based off name value alone, should get you a haul. Now, he's also a really talented player. He's only had 2 weeks as a wide receiver 1 so far this season, and so we haven't seen quite even what we've seen from Nabers, in the sense of Nabers has 3 such weeks, but it's still been pretty good. And, you know, not every wide receiver is going to be, like I said, with Nabers, not every wide receiver, but like these two, are going to be able to have a Puka Nacua, Jamar Chase, Justin Jefferson type of season because of a myriad of factors. And so specifically with MHJ, he's been isolated a lot as an X wide receiver. He's very good, but they aren't really doing a lot to help him. And so he's basically having to create everything on his own. And one interesting thing is they, in general, target him a lot more in the first quarter of games and don't really get him as involved later in games. It's bewildering, but he's a really talented player, and he does have Kyler Murray at the helm, which isn't an elite quarterback for his production purposes, but you could definitely do worse, and it is good that he's locked in long term. So when we think about the season that MHJ is having, he is the wide receiver 25, so that's really good. That's technically a high-end wide receiver 3, but you know, right in that the low-end wide receiver 2 range. We've seen some massive highs, but we've also seen a really low floor. I do think that he's going to grow a lot as a player. I do think he's going to, you know, if they do a little bit more to help him by scheming him open, putting him in the slot just a little bit more, I do think that's going to work because we all know that he can win by himself on the line of scrimmage as an X. But, you know, it would be nice to try to help him out and not make him have to work for literally everything. When we think about how he's been utilized, he's played 25.8% of the snaps from the slot and 74.2% out wide. So that is pretty good in terms of moving him around the formation. I would prefer it be a little bit closer to 30%, if not a little bit more in the slot though, but fine. His 1.97 yards per out run ranked 30th. His 79.6 PFF receiving grade is tied for 19th. His 2.2 yards after catch per reception is tied for 94th. And so he, kind of like Drake London and Justin Jefferson, is more of a get open and get the ball guy than per se a wicked after catch guy like a Chase or a Malik Nabers type. But like I said earlier, it's just about how many points you score. We don't care how you do it. He coincidentally has not even forced a missed tackle yet, so that's interesting. It doesn't really matter that much, but like I said, not really the yards after catch guy. His 9 contested catches are tied for 10th. His 59 targets are 32nd. His 33 receptions are tied for 42nd. His 499 receiving yards are 31st. But his 6 touchdowns are tied for 3rd. One thing I hadn't mentioned yet is that he is really good in the red zone, even at the NFL level. He's definitely their preferred option at the expense of Trey McBride this season. And so I do think that he is going to be a lot better in terms of for fantasy purposes for the majority of his career. I do think the slow start has a lot to do with how they're utilizing him and that they're not really doing a ton to help him get extra production. But I do think that he definitely has the potential to be a top 5 wide receiver at any given point in time. And so as he gains more experience at the NFL level, I do think he's going to produce a lot more than he currently is. But like I said, we've seen a lot of upside. It's just more so like with Drake London about raising that floor and just being a little bit more consistent. My Dynasty wide receiver 9 is A.J. Brown of the Philadelphia Eagles. Now, he's 27 years and 4 months old. So statistically over the age apex of 26. He does, though, have Jalen Hurts that he's connected to, so really good quarterback long term. Not the best thrower of the ball, but you'll take it. He is the number one wide receiver on his own team, although he does have some target competition. His ceiling is kind of like that of Justin Jefferson and CeeDee Lamb, give or take a little bit. Maybe a little bit lower than CeeDee Lamb's, but very good. And his floor in general is pretty solid as well. Not quite that of Justin Jefferson. But one of the main reasons why he's a tier 2 wide receiver to me is that he's 27 years and 4 months old. So he still has plenty of years in production left. It's just, historically, he is past the age apex. And then some of these guys ahead of him have quite a few more years of total production left. Now, he's missed some time, but he's had 3 weeks inside the top 12 at wide receiver. And considering he's only played 7 games, that's really good. He also had a bye week. And he's been, over the past 2 seasons, the wide receiver 5 and 6. 4 seasons ago, he was the wide receiver 12. In 2021, he only played 13 games. And actually, when he was the wide receiver 12 in 2020, he only played 14 games, which is impressive. But he has missed times. He has missed some time here and there with some nicks and bruises. But before this season, he had played every game the previous 2. So I definitely wouldn't consider him anything remotely close to injury prone or anything like that. But yeah, it's just that he's been around a little bit and he's a little bit older. When we think about how he's utilized, he's played 20.1% of the snaps from the slot, 79.9% out wide. His yards per out run of 3.24 is second in the NFL. Really good. His 90.3 PFF receiving grade is second. Awesome. His 5.8 yards after catch per reception is 26th. His 5 missed tackles forced is tied for 33rd. His 8 contested catches are tied for 17th. Now, his production is going to be a little bit lower because just like with Nabers and Collins, he's missed some time. His 48 targets are tied for 48th. His 33 receptions are tied for 42nd. His 618 receiving yards are 17th, and his 3 touchdowns are tied for 33rd. And so, yeah, in terms of current win now production, he's probably, in my opinion, around a top 5 option in terms of 2024 fantasy production on any given week. But like I said, just due to age, he's going to be a little bit further down these rankings. But yeah, if you have him on your roster, you're obviously not scared in any way, shape, or form about his age. And he is a tier 2 asset, in my opinion, at wide receiver. My Dynasty wide receiver 10 is Garrett Wilson of the New York Jets. So he's 24 years and 3 months old, so still really young, like that. Now, his ceiling is a little bit lower than the Jefferson, the Lamb, in my opinion. Definitely lower than Nabers and Chase. But it's pretty good. It's around 30 points, give or take, so far. In terms of his quarterback play, just like with Drake London, the first 2 seasons of his career, it definitely held him back immensely. Just like with London, it was worse than 32nd best quarterback play. Terrible head coaching, same story there. However, he did have 1,100 yards his fresh rookie season, and then he had almost 1,100 this past season. And so he definitely was able to produce. It was just that the touchdowns weren't there, and he was really inefficient because of the accuracy of the passes being thrown to him and the fact that he was the only asset in the passing game besides running back Breece Hall. And so that did limit him. Now he has Aaron Rodgers for this season, maybe next season, we'll see. But after that, the quarterback situation is a little bit murky. And so I have him a little bit down here. If this was Rodgers 4 years ago, I would have him probably at the top of tier 2, maybe at the low end of tier 1. But regardless, he's a really good asset to have. And so he's kind of like Drake London in that he's not on the consistent upward trajectory, but it's definitely explainable. He was the wide receiver 21 in his rookie season, then the wide receiver 26 this past year. Now he's the wide receiver 5. Just like with Drake London, you get a quarterback, voila. Now, I really like his utilization because his slot snap percentage is over 30% while still being a primarily outside wide receiver. I really like that because you can win outside, but you're also given those freebies in the slot so you can avoid the best corner, at least generally. So he's played 33.1% of his snaps from the slot, 66.2% out wide. Now, his 1.73 yards per out run is 45th. That's just not very good. Rodgers, while it's been a definite upgrade, hasn't been fantastic. And Wilson does need to be more consistent on a route per route basis. However, when we look at his 80.3 PFF receiving grade, that's 21st, so that's pretty good. His 4.1 yards after catch per reception is tied for 51st. So he actually is really good after the catch, but I'm really not sure in particular as to why that number isn't a little bit higher. He's really good after the catch. His 15 missed tackles forced is second in the NFL, and there's your evidence there. His 13 contested catches are tied for fourth. His 106 targets are first, not tied, just first. His 69 receptions are second. His 722 yards are sixth, and his 5 touchdowns are tied for eighth. This is what we expected to see from Garrett Wilson now that he finally has a good quarterback. It's just, what is the future going to look like for him? And for that reason, that's why I have him a little bit lower than some of these other guys, because they either have been more consistently dominant, they either have more upside, they have better long-term stability, at least projected for quarterbacks. And so for that reason, I have him in this spot as a tier 2 wide receiver, as my wide receiver 10, but he's still a fantastic asset to have. And should the Jets get another quarterback, he definitely has the ability to move way higher up these rankings because he's not even remotely close to the age apex of 26. So my wide receiver 11 is Puka Nacua. He's only 23 years and 4 months old, so still well below the age apex of 26. For now, he has Matt Stafford. So kind of like with Rodgers and Garrett Wilson, it's kind of risky in terms of what his future prospects look like at QB, but I do like his QB situation better because I do think Stafford is going to play a little bit longer. But he also has a little bit more target competition right now with Cooper Kupp, but I think he's firmly established himself as a wide receiver 1 in his own offense now. And so he's a really talented player with a really high ceiling. Probably on a week-to-week basis, his ceiling is definitely below Chase. I think below what Nabers' maximum ceiling would be, but right in line with basically all of these other wide receivers. One of the only issues I have with him, his floor is also pretty good, by the way, as well, is that he is always injured. And the best ability, as they say, is availability. That is one thing. He is always on the injury report. He's always getting hurt mid-game. And as somebody who owned him, I traded him away in a package to get Nabers in a league. It just hurt my soul to see him always on the injury report. He's a really tough guy. He plays like a bulldozer off after the catch. And he's a really good person as well. He's really cool. It's just so scary owning him. Now, one thing about Puka is I really don't think he gets the respect that he deserves because he's one of those wide receivers like Nico Collins that wasn't a heralded first-round pick. Now, he did fall in the draft because of injury concerns. He was always injured in college too. But he was a really talented prospect coming out. Now, I had no idea he would be the wide receiver 4 in his rookie season. I don't think anybody did. But yeah, I mean, when you put up a wide receiver 4 finish as a rookie with 160 targets, those are earned targets. It doesn't matter that Cooper Kupp was out. He, in general, more often than not, with Cooper Kupp playing, was the wide receiver 1. At worst, they switched off games this past season. Although, to be fair, Cooper Kupp probably wasn't healthy the entire season. But this season, he's, in my opinion, firmly established himself as a wide receiver 1. He just, once again, has dealt with injuries. I think when he plays, he's going to be, a top 8 wide receiver on a weekly basis. It's just the injury concerns. I would like if he was used a little bit more in the slot, but he can definitely win on the outside, obviously. He's used a lot in motion, and he's almost always open because he's a good route runner. He's really intelligent, and he's in a great scheme with a great QB. So we see that he's played 24.4% of his snaps from the slot and 74% out wide. I would like the slot percentage up just a little bit to get some easier targets for him, but he gets a lot of very accurate open targets anyway, so yeah. When I look at his yards per out run, though, 3.13 is 4th in the entire NFL. His 86.3 PFF receiving grade is 7th. His yak per reception of 5.9 is 25th. His missed tackles forced of 4 is tied for 38th. His 1 contested catch is tied for 91st. Obviously, when you miss time, some of these numbers are going to be a little bit lower. His 39 targets are 71st. His 28 receptions are 57th. His 373 receiving yards are 58th. And his 1 touchdown is tied for 72nd. So once again, really high upside player who's in general really consistent with a great QB in a great offense with an offensive minded head coach is what you could consider to be a target hog because of the immense total passing volume and that he's the wide receiver one in terms of the volume distribution. It's just injuries. And so that is what, in my opinion, is going to keep him until he can prove to be a little bit more consistent in terms of his ability to be available from being a tier one asset at wide receiver. But make no mistake, in terms of actual talent and ability to put up points, he should be a tier one wide receiver. My Dynasty wide receiver 12 and the first player in the B tier, the third tier of wide receivers, is Brian Thomas Jr. of the Jacksonville Jaguars. So he's 22 years and 1 month old. He's a rookie. He has Trevor Lawrence as his QB. Now, people really don't like Trevor Lawrence, but he's a pretty good quarterback. He's had terrible coaching and terrible offensive lines as well for the entirety of his career. And until this season, didn't even have a number one target to throw to. So I think people are a little bit ridiculous in their hatred of T-Law just because he hasn't produced as this generational quarterback. I think the same thing is happening with Caleb, where you have bad coaching and bad offensive lines, and then people wonder why these guys aren't magnets for production immediately. I think that's why. And getting back to BTJ, he has a solid amount of upside. I would say it's probably a little bit worse than in general Amon-Ra St. Brown's, but the floor, because of a total lack of volume, is going to be another reason why he's not in this first or second tier. But he's a really talented player, and he's obviously nowhere remotely close to the age apex of 26. Now, something that I think is keeping him from being valued closer to Marvin Harrison Jr. is that before the draft, he wasn't viewed as this can't-miss generational prospect. He did have a lot of flaws to his game. He didn't really play big in the sense of with his catch radius that he has. He has the arm length and the leaping ability to theoretically be a Mike Evans type of player, give or take, but he doesn't play as big. His route tree was limited a lot of times to comebacks and 9 routes. He was a vertical plane wide receiver in college. And so the question was, can he really work the route tree? The answer is yes. He's really good. And so right now he's the wide receiver 11. That is incredibly impressive considering he hasn't had Trevor Lawrence the past 2 games. And so like I said, I can't be anything but impressed with him. When you take a look at how he's performed this season, he's played 25.6% of his routes from the slot and 74.4% out wide. In general, I would like the slot percentage, like I said, with all these guys to be a little bit higher, right around that 30% range, but it's fine. It's similar to that of Marvin Harrison Jr. in terms of the slot versus out wide percentage, but his yards per out run of 2.27 is tied for 19th. Great. His 81.1 PFF receiving grade is 18th. Great. His 6.5 yak per reception is tied for 17th. His 5 missed tackles forced is tied for 33rd. His 4 contested catches are tied for 52nd. He's not the best guy in close quarters. He's more of I'm going to get open through raw speed and burst than per se physicality at the catch point. His 62 targets are tied for 25th. His 42 receptions are tied for 26th. However, when you look at his receiving yards, his 689 are 10th. This guy is a big play threat. His 5 touchdowns are also tied for 8th. When you consider that he hasn't had T-Law the past 2 weeks, the Jags are incredibly dysfunctional, and he's had to contend with Evan Ingram, Christian Kirk for a good amount of the season, that along with being a rookie, the wide receiver 11 fantasy finish that he is currently at right now is incredibly impressive. I think he has the ability to move way up these rankings. I want to see more of a ceiling from him. The consistency in terms of his floor has been amazing, though, when you consider the context of his situation around him and that he was considered a really raw player coming out. And yeah, I love Brian Thomas Jr., and he has the potential to be a tier 1 asset at wide receiver if he continues to expand his route tree in terms of his ability to run every route, and then also if he were to get a lot more consistent volume. The total volume, despite playing in 11 games, he has the 25th most targets. That should definitely be a lot higher, in my opinion, in terms of how talented he is compared to the players around him. But yeah, I do think that he has the ability to be a tier 1 asset. I just want to see more of a ceiling from him, and I want to see him do this over a longer period of time with more volume. My wide receiver 13 and the second player in tier 3 of wide receivers is Odunze of the Chicago Bears. So he's 22 years and 4 months old, so still pretty young as well, just like with Brian Thomas Jr. The problem with him, and the only reason he's this far down in the Dynasty rankings, is because Caleb Williams has gotten off to a little bit of a slow start. I do think Shane Waldron has a ton to do with it, as well as the offensive line. But Caleb definitely has some flaws, and they're following him from college. And so that, combined with the fact that they have DJ Moore and Keenan Allen on this team, really makes the target competition incredibly high, and in my opinion, just about the highest of anybody in the NFL. But against Indianapolis in week 3, when Keenan Allen missed that game, he was immediately the wide receiver 11. And he also had another 100-yard game 2 weeks ago, and he had 2 clutch fourth quarter grabs right in a row to extend the drive before the Bears ended up losing anyways. He's a really good player. He's always open. He's incredibly physical at the catch point, and he is really tough after the catch. He kind of like Marvin Harrison Jr. isn't going to be the massive yards after catch guy in general, but he's very good at being physical and breaking tackles. And so right now he is the wide receiver 49, so definitely nothing special in terms of right now. But when you add the context of the poor coaching situation, being with a rookie quarterback and having the immense target competition that he has on his team, you can definitely understand why he isn't producing at an elite level. I love his utilization though. 34.2% of his snaps from the slot, 65.6% out wide. Beautiful. When we look at his yards per out run, his 1.34 is 69th, so not great. His 65.0 PFF receiving grade is 75th. His 4.8 yards after catch per reception is tied for 33rd. His missed tackles forced of 4 is tied for 38th. His 6 contested catches are tied for 35th. But when you think about some of these stats, you need to look at the production, specifically the targets. His 58 targets are tied for 34th. And so I think that plays a big factor here. I think a lot of these numbers would be a lot better if he was receiving more targets. His 34 receptions are 41st. His 479 receiving yards are 37th. And his 1 touchdown is tied for 72nd. And so, in my opinion, Odunze is more so a play for the future. I really like that he's connected to Caleb long term. We saw a beautiful back shoulder ball between the two of them where they, right as the snap was called, Rome threw his hand up and Caleb knew to throw a back shoulder to him. So I really like the connection between the two of them. It appears to be growing. And I really think that as long as they get somebody semi-competent, which is, given their history of coaching selections, you could definitely question whether or not that will happen. But I think even if they just get somebody mediocre, that he is going to be a very good wide receiver for a long time. I think that Caleb is going to work out too. And so I think in the future, he's going to be in general a low-end wide receiver 1 in terms of his total production. And I do think that he's going to overtake DJ Moore in terms of being the consistent number 1 wide receiver. He is perfectly built to be the X running the big boy routes one-on-one, but he also has the positional versatility to play all over the field. And I really think that we're going to see a lot better from him in terms of consistency and total ceiling on a week-to-week basis. At wide receiver 14, I have Ladd McConkey of the Chargers. He's 23 years old, so a little bit older than the previous 2 players, but, much before the age apex of 26, so it doesn't really matter. He also has, I don't even know if it's arguable, the best quarterback between the 3 of them in Justin Herbert. The only issue with him is he's more of a slot flanker type than somebody that can win at X. Rome and Brian Thomas Jr. can definitely win at X. And so I do think that's one thing that distinguishes him. Now, that doesn't always matter because players like Amon-Ra St. while they can play X, are generally more so slot receivers and they can still produce at elite levels. So that's not really per se a criticism, but in my opinion, it does lower his maximum potential upside on a week-to-week basis. But post-bye, the Chargers have been throwing quite a bit more, and we've seen a couple of very good games from him with over 100 receiving yards. And so when we think about how he's performed this year, he's currently the wide receiver 18. Perfect. A little bit below Brian Thomas Jr. It's definitely above Rome Odunze, but when you consider their situations, I definitely can explain that for Rome, but he's been awesome. The one thing, like I was saying, though, is he's more so a slot flanker type. He's played 70.9% of his snaps from the slot and 28% out wide. So not quite the utilization I would prefer out of my wide receiver, but he still gets fantasy points and he's a really good player. His 2.24 yards per out run is 21st. His 81.9 PFF receiving grade is tied for 15th. His 5 yards after catch per reception is 30th. His 8 missed tackles forced is tied for 12th. His 6 contested catches is tied for 35th. His 62 targets are tied for 25th. His 43 receptions are tied for 24th. His 615 receiving yards are 18th. And his 4 touchdowns are tied for 16th. And so, like I said, post-bye, he's definitely picked it up a little bit. I really think he's going to be more so a player that his maximum ceiling is going to be more around that Amon-Ra St. type than per se the Chase type. Whereas I think players like Brian Thomas Jr. and Rome Odunze are going to have higher ceilings than Ladd on a week-to-week basis. But I think Ladd is going to be a very consistent floor player, and I could definitely see him being an Amon-Ra St. type because while he's definitely used more in the slot than Amon-Ra St. is, at least this year, I definitely could see them being the, at least hyper-targeted isn't really the right word in the sense of, I don't ever think the passing volume with the current offensive coordinator, trust me, I'm a Ravens fan, is going to allow him to receive the maximum amount of targets that you would see from some of these other guys. And so I do think that's going to be something that gets in the way. But as far as his talent as a player and in terms of how he can produce for fantasy, I definitely think he has the ability to be a high-end wide receiver 2, maybe even a low-end wide receiver 1 type on a week-to-week basis. And I definitely want to see if his usage continues to increase post-bye, because if I'm wrong and he is able to garner more total target volume, he definitely has the ability to move way up in these rankings. My Dynasty wide receiver 15 and the first player in tier 4, in my opinion, is Rashee Rice of the Kansas City Chiefs. So he's 24 years and 5 months old. Now, he might even be a tier 1 asset if he didn't just have a severe knee injury, which will keep him out for the entirety of this season. But then he's also likely to have at least some kind of suspension this next season. And so for that reason, we don't know how he's going to come back from the injury. And we don't know exactly when he's even going to be allowed to play. And so for that reason, I have him a little bit lower because you're not going to get that production and the uncertainty behind what his future might look like. But in terms of talent, he has it. In terms of quarterback stability, he has the most stable asset in terms of probability to remain the quarterback for their team, in my opinion, in Patrick Mahomes. His role was perfect. He was the short yardage target hog. He's very good at getting yards after catch. And so he was going off at the beginning of the season. I tried to trade for him in a couple dynasty leagues and nobody wanted to for good reason before the season. But yeah, his max upside, I honestly don't even know. It's probably really high. I wouldn't say it's Jamar Chase or what Malik Nabers could potentially do, but probably, give or take, Justin Jefferson-y, maybe CeeDee Lamb type of upside. But yeah, and his floor should be really good if he maintains that role post-injury. So Rashee Rice was on an upward trajectory. Obviously, he was elite over the first couple weeks of the season. This past season, he finished as the wide receiver 27, but he really started to pick up steam in the latter half of the year. And like I said, who knows when he'll come back after the injury and potential suspension. Another thing I don't per se like in the sense of I would prefer my wide receiver be able to win more so outside, but it doesn't really matter to a degree, I guess, is he played 50.5% of his snaps from the slot and 49.5% out wide. So more along the lines of an Amon-Ra St. Brown type in the sense of the usage, but fantastic player. His 3.16 yards per out run were third at the time in which he was injured. His 85.5 PFF receiving grade was 10th. Look at his yards after catch per reception, though. 7.7 was tied for 6th. Crazy. And his 8 missed tackles forced is still tied for 12, and he only played in 3 in a portion of another game. That's how good this guy is after the catch. Really good. Now, he didn't happen to have any contested catches. Fine. And then his total production is obviously going to suffer because just like with Nabers and some of these other guys, he's missed time. But his 29 targets are tied for 91st. His 24 receptions tied for 68th. His 288 receiving yards, 72nd. And his 2 touchdowns tied for 53rd. But yeah, I really think that he's going to retain the short yardage role. I think he's going to replace Travis Kelce in the sense of the usage in this offense when he returns. It's just, when is that going to happen? And is he going to be quite the same player post-injury and suspension? Only time will tell, but I think he has the absolute ability to move way up these rankings. My wide receiver 16 is Zay Flowers of the Baltimore Ravens. So he's 24 years and 2 months old, still a really young prospect going into his second season. He wasn't particularly young in the sense of coming out, but still well below the age apex of 26. In terms of his quarterback situation, really good. Lamar Jackson. He is definitely, in my opinion, the wide receiver 1 on the team. Even though they brought in Deontay Johnson, he hasn't done anything. Rashad Bateman hasn't stepped up. Andrews isn't being targeted like he was. He was really the wide receiver 1 last year. But yeah, Zay Flowers has taken over that role. He's really good after the catch. His size does, in my opinion, kind of limit him because he doesn't have the ridiculous speed that Tyreek Hill had that allowed him, despite not being very tall, produces a really high-end asset. But he definitely has a pretty good ceiling. It's just the floor, at least at this point of his career, definitely isn't the best. So one thing, like with a lot of these guys, is he's an ascending talent. He finished as the wide receiver 31 in his rookie season, and currently he's the wide receiver 8. We like that. He already almost has the same amount of touchdowns as he did this past season, as well as the receiving yardage. So perfect. And I like his usage a lot more than some of these other guys. I would prefer his slot snap percentage to be a little bit less in terms of what I would want from an ideal wide receiver, but still, I like that it's over 30%. He plays 38.4% of his snaps from the slot and 61.3% out wide. His 2.18 yards per out run is 23rd. His 81.7 PFF receiving grade is 17th. His 7.1 yards after catch per reception is 12th. Beautiful. Just like Rashee Rice, very good after the catch. His missed tackles forced of 14 is 3rd. Yeah. His 7 contested catches are tied for 26th. His 75 targets are tied for 12th. His 52 receptions are 11th. His 727 receiving yards are 5th. And his 4 touchdowns are tied for 16th. Really, this is a guy that I think his ceiling is somewhat limited. He's unlikely to have a 40-point game, in my opinion. 30 points is definitely within his range of outcomes. And so I do think that his total ceiling is lower than that of CeeDee Lamb's and probably Justin Jefferson's on a week-to-week basis. And I would just like to see a little bit more consistency. And I say that because he's had 3 weeks as a top 10 wide receiver, but he's also had 4 weeks with less than 10 fantasy points. So the consistency isn't quite what you would prefer, but you'll definitely take it. And considering he was probably a really late round 1 pick this past season, I think to potentially even a early round 2, depending on your league size and what the team needs and whoever selected who, you definitely have to be happy with the outcome here. And I think he does have the ability to move up. And if he can just get that floor up, he's going to be a much better asset than he already currently is. At wide receiver 17, I have JSN. So he's 22 years and 7 months old, well below the age apex of 26. The issue with him is that he is the first wide receiver I've listed that is definitively unlikely, at least in my opinion, to become the number one wide receiver on his own team if anyone else isn't already. So he has DK Metcalf on his team, who is an ex wide receiver and is one of the most physically dominant wide receivers we've ever seen. JSN is a really good player, but this past season he was behind both DK Metcalf and Tyler Lockett in the pecking order. At times he's been behind Tyler Lockett, but I think recently he's overtaken him as a wide receiver 2. But he's just probably never going to be the wide receiver 1, at least in my opinion. And so I do think that limits his total upside. But we've seen 3 games this year where he has posted fantastic production. But we've also seen where he's been really inefficient with some production and then had a limited or a really low floor due to a lack of volume. I really do wish they would use him more vertically downfield consistently. But I do think that he has a lot more upside than what we've seen through the majority of his career so far. So when we think about JSN, he is clearly an ascending asset. He finished as the wide receiver 48 in his rookie season, and he's currently the wide receiver 10. This is a really particularly bad year, in my opinion, for wide receiver production. And so I do think that in general, he wouldn't be the wide receiver 10 most years, but props to him. He's a really good player. I just worry about the consistency with him, at least with Tyler Lockett still there. If Lockett leaves next year, I do think that he has the potential to be probably a high-end wide receiver 2 in general, assuming that there isn't another strange year from wide receivers in terms of production. But JSN also is by far and away, in terms of players that I think could realistically be elite assets at wide receiver, he is by far and away the most slot-only wide receiver. Now, he does have the ability to win outside, but he's just generally used in the slot. He's played 86.1% of his snaps from the slot and only 13.9% out wide. His 1.72 yards per out run is 46th. His 78.3 receiving grade is 27th. His yak per reception of 4.6 is tied for 37th. But his 8 missed tackles forced is tied for 12th. His 7 contested are tied for 26th. His 84 targets are 7th. His 60 receptions are 7th. His 678 receiving yards are 12th. And his 3 touchdowns are tied for 33rd. Like I said, if Lockett leaves, I do like his potential in the short term, but the question will be, if Geno Smith regresses or retires, what will it look like for him if he doesn't have a QB? I'm not really sure, but that uncertainty and that he's the wide receiver 2 on his own team, in my opinion, is going to limit where he can realistically be in these rankings. At wide receiver 18, I have George Pickens of the Pittsburgh Steelers. So he's 23 years and 7 months old, so still well below the age apex of 26. He is the number 1 target on his team. The only issue is he's on the Steelers. And so for the short term, Russ Wilson has unlocked his potential. But how long is Russ going to be on the team? Is he going to retire soon? Is he really going to regress a lot, even more than he already has as a player? And then the other thing is with Justin Fields, he really wasn't performing like this. And so I think he's a really talented player. But also, he doesn't have the name brand value in the community. So in terms of his trade value, I don't think it's as high as some of these other guys like Garrett Wilson or Drake London, despite the fact that they're similar in the sense of they haven't really been able to produce with horrific quarterback situations, but once they receive adequate quarterback play, they've performed a lot better. And so for that reason, I really do think that he is a little bit below some of these other guys. But if Russ can continue to play like this, or especially if they can get a quarterback that's younger and tied to him long-term, I do think that the ceiling for him is pretty high. And so what I like about George Pickens is that he's gradually increased his production. In his rookie season, he was the wide receiver 39, then the wide receiver 30 this past season, and the wide receiver 17 this year. So we like the increase in production. For his usage, he is generally an X wide receiver, but I do like that they are using him in the slot some. He's played 27.1% of his snaps from the slot and 72.9% out wide. I really like his yards per out run. His 2.53 is 8th. His 81.9 PFF receiving grade is tied for 15th. His yards after catch per reception of 3.5 is tied for 70th. He isn't amazing after the catch, but surprisingly enough, he has 9 missed tackles forced, which is tied for 8th. I do think he's overachieving there, but props to him. His 8 contested catches are tied for 17th. His 75 targets are tied for 12th. His 48 receptions are tied for 15th. His 728 receiving yards are 4th, and his 2 receiving touchdowns are tied for 53rd. Now, I will say he has been by far the most unlucky wide receiver for touchdowns. He's had, 4 or 5 of them called back by either barely being out of bounds or a penalty. So he definitely could have had a much better season and been a lot higher in terms of his fantasy finish right now. I just think that he is a little bit less talented than some of these other guys ranked ahead of him. And I do worry about his long-term production. And I do think that in combination with him not having as much perceived value in the community does put him a little bit lower. But I do think that he is on the rise as a wide receiver. And if there could be any stability in terms of quarterback play long-term, I think that he would be much more valuable than where he currently is in my rankings. My wide receiver 19 is Jayden Reed of the Green Bay Packers. So despite only being in his second season, he's 24 years and 5 months old. So definitely under the age apex of 26, but a little bit older. He was definitely an older prospect. Now, I do think he's by far and away the most talented wide receiver on the Packers, and I think he deserves to have by far and away the largest target share. The only issue is he doesn't get that target share. His target volume is rather inconsistent from week to week, but I think that due to the 10 touchdowns he scored this past season and the fact that he is a really good player, that his fantasy value in the sense of the community sentiment on him is pretty high. He definitely has some massive boom weeks. But I think due to the fact that he's not necessarily any given week the wide receiver 1 on his own team, it does ding him a little bit, but he's also more of a slot flanker type. You really don't want him at X. But I will say, while his floor isn't that high or isn't as high as you would prefer, his ceiling is pretty decent. You can definitely have a mid-30s in terms of points in any individual game. And I really like that he's with Jordan Love long-term. So there are definitely a lot of pros. It's just the total volume and his ability in terms of where he can play on the field do limit him somewhat. And so getting into his lack of consistency, he's been the wide receiver 1 and wide receiver 2 in individual weeks this year. But other than that, he hasn't had a single wide receiver 1 week. And so somehow he's the wide receiver 12. That should tell you everything you need to know in the sense of wide receiver production this season. Like I said, really good player, but the usage just isn't there. And we shouldn't conflate that just because he's the wide receiver 12, that's the same every given year, if you know what I mean. But really good player and ascending. We like that. He finished as a wide receiver 25 in his rookie year, and now he's the wide receiver 12. So growth. We like that. Now, but here's what I was getting at. Just like with JSN, he's more of a slot receiver, but I will say I think JSN is much more suited to be an outside guy than Jayden Reed is. I do think Reed is limited, but really good player. He's played 79.6% of his snaps from the slot and 16.2% out wide, but his yards per out run of 2.59 is 7th. Beautiful. His PFF receiving grade of 71.1 is 44th. His yards after catch per reception is 7.9. That is 5th. He is very good. Yeah, he was compared to a baby Debo Samuel. He does get utilization in the running game. Really good after the catch. His 6 missed tackles forced is tied for 25th. His 7 contested catches are tied for 26th. His 49 targets are 47th. His 38 receptions are tied for 34th. His 643 receiving yards, however, are 14th, which is crazy when you consider his targets and receptions. And then his 4 touchdowns are tied for 16th. So like I said, a really high upside player any given week. He just lacks the floor due to the lack of target volume. And as a real life player, he is a little bit limited to being a flanker or slot wide receiver. And in general, it is tough when you're not your own team's wide receiver one in any given week, as well as having limitations to really ascend too much further up the rankings. But I do think he's really talented, and I definitely believe in him in the long term, and I think he could definitely get a little bit better than he currently is now. Our wide receiver 20 and the first player in tier 5 is DeVonta Smith of the Philadelphia Eagles. So he is 26 years old, so statistically, right at the age apex. Due to age, he's going to be a little bit further down, but just like with JSN for sure, he's definitively the own number 2 receiver on his team. So that does limit his upside when AJ Brown plays. However, he's generally consistent. He does have some upside, but in general, he's not going to give you 30-point games very often, but he can easily give you 20 any given week. He's tied to Jalen Hurts for the long term. Love that. He just signed an extension as well. And so in a pretty decent offense, a really good offense right now, I should say, as the team's wide receiver 2, there's definitely some value to that, but I don't really see him, to be honest with you, ascending much further in these rankings. In fact, I think he's at best going to just generally stay where he is right now. But like I said, really like him, but he's definitively the number 2 on his own team, and he really doesn't have a massive ceiling. When we think about DeVonta Smith, in my opinion, he's already hit his peak in terms of his maximum, probably his highest finish he'll have in his career. In his rookie season, he was the wide receiver 29, but then in his second year, he was the wide receiver 9 overall. Then he went to the wide receiver 19 this past season while missing a game. And he has missed some time this year, but he's the wide receiver 26. I really do think he's more of a wide receiver 2 than a wide receiver 1 in terms of his total potential, especially with AJ Brown playing. Now, he definitely could play X at the NFL level. You would prefer him not to have to. And with AJ Brown there, he doesn't need to, which is good. And so that's why you're going to see him with the higher slot snap percentage. He's played 52.9% there, as opposed to 46.7% out wide. His 1.88 yards per out run is 35th. His 78.9 PFF receiving grade is 24th. His 4.4 yards after catch per reception is tied for 41st. His 7 missed tackles forced is tied for 20th. His 5 contested catches are tied for 43rd. His 55 targets are 39th. His 41 receptions are tied for 29th. His 516 receiving yards are 30th. And his 4 receiving touchdowns are tied for 16th. Like I said, a really solid player, more of a solid floor type with, in general, mid-20s point ceiling outcomes. He's definitively the number 2 on his own team, so he's a really good asset to have, but probably not going to be moving any further up in these rankings. My wide receiver 21 is DJ Moore of the Chicago Bears. So he's 27 years and 6 months old, well past the age apex of 26, so historically probably going to be declining somewhat soon, even though it's probably going to be just slightly at first. Now, he traditionally has been his own team's number 1 wide receiver easily, and through some of the year he has for sure this season, but I do think that Odunze is taking over the number 1 role on this team. And so for that reason, I do think that his value at the end of this past season was by far and away the highest it's going to be, because he just signed an extension too. And so I do like that he's with Caleb, just like I like it for Rome. And so I do think that he's going to turn in some wide receiver 1 performances in terms of relative to his own team. But I do think that Rome, more often than not, is probably going to be the leading target earner, as in general the X. And so I do like that he has Caleb Williams long term. Now, what is the ceiling? Well, this season it really hasn't been very good. He's had a couple solid games like the one against Carolina, the revenge game, but his floor has been really low. And with him potentially being pigeonholed into the number 2 role on his own team, I do view him in a similar vein as DeVonta Smith. So DJ Moore has dealt with, for the majority of his career, horrible quarterback plays. So his fantasy finishes were never really indicative of how good he was as a player. He's been the wide receiver 16, 23, 18, 24. He was the wide receiver 6 this past season, and now he's the wide receiver 29. This is looking like by far going to be the worst season of his career from a production standpoint, but being there with Keenan Allen and Rome Odunze, while being under Shane Waldron with a rookie quarterback in Caleb Williams that hasn't been the generational talent in terms of his production on the field so far. Definitely has hurt him there. Now, I do like his utilization, but I would prefer him to be a little bit more in the slot, as well as I definitely would love it if he was purely the flanker with Rome at X. But he's played 24.2% of his snaps from the slot and 74.6 out wide. His 1.19 yards per out run is tied for 75th. His PFF receiving grade of 65.7 is 72nd. His yards after catch per reception of 4.9 is tied for 31st. His 5 missed tackles forced is tied for 33rd. His 9 contested catches are tied for 12th. His 70 targets are tied for 14th. His 47 receptions are tied for 18th. His 460 receiving yards are 40th. And his 3 receiving touchdowns are tied for 33rd. And so, like I said, I think he's more talented than where he is in these rankings, but with him being over 27 years old, midway between 27 and 28, he's likely to be declining, even if it's ever so slowly. I do think that he's starting to become the number 2 on his own team, and we really don't know what the coaching staff is going to look like, as well as Caleb long term. I do believe in Caleb and Rome and DJ Moore, but there is uncertainty there. And so given his age and potentially being replaced in terms of being the number 1 wide receiver, that is why DJ Moore is ranked down here. My wide receiver 22 in Dynasty is going to be DK Metcalf. So he's 26 years and 9 months old, so slightly older than the age apex of 26, but not enough for it to be a big deal. But this tier of wide receivers are the wide receivers that are over the age apex, but aren't necessarily producing like elite wide receiver ones and haven't been for an extended period of time. And that's why some of these guys wouldn't be getting the ranking of, say, AJ Brown, but he's a really talented player. He is the number 1 on his own team. He does have 30-point upside, but the floor is he's had plenty of sub 10-point games this season. So a little bit inconsistent there. And then, like I said, the quarterback situation long-term with Geno being 34 is a little bit iffy. And so for that reason, he is going to be a little bit lower in these rankings. But like I said, also, he is one of the most physically dominant wide receivers we have ever seen. All right, so DK Metcalf, towards the beginning of his career, was looking like he had the potential to be the Dynasty wide receiver 1 for a minute. After posting a wide receiver 34 finish in his rookie season, which is still really impressive. You know, I've said it a couple times, but people are just so spoiled by the Jamar Chase, Justin Jefferson, Puka Nacua rookie seasons that 900 yards and 7 touchdowns like he had in his rookie season would be considered fine, but nothing special. That is an incredible season for a rookie. Then he was a wide receiver 7. The trajectory was immense. Then he finished as a wide receiver 14, 16, 21, and now he's the wide receiver 23. Now, he has missed some time this season, but like I said, due to age and the uncertainty in the future at QB, I am going to have him a little bit lower. He's an outside wide receiver. He only plays 15% of his snaps from the slot, and he plays 84.4% of his snaps out wide. His yards per out run of 1.98 is tied for 30th. His PFF receiving grade of 73.5 is 39th. His 4.7 yards after catch per reception is tied for 35th. His 3 missed tackles forced is tied for 50th. His 9 contested catches are tied for 12th. His 70 targets are tied for 14th. His 40 receptions are tied for 26th. And his 638 receiving yards are 15th, with his 3 touchdowns being tied for 33rd. Overall, he is somebody that can give you fantastic win now production. He should still be a really good wide receiver to own for a couple more years. But I do think that he is going to start declining relatively soon, even if it's just little bit by little bit. And just due to age and the uncertainty at QB in the future, it is really tough to project, say, 2 years from now, what DK Metcalf's production is going to look like. But as I've said a couple times, he is one of the most physically dominant players at the wide receiver position that we have ever seen. So my wide receiver 23 is Brandon Aiyuk of the San Fran 49ers. He's 26 years and 6 months old, so slightly over the age apex of 26, but nothing to be particularly worried about. Now, his situation is a little bit tricky, right? Now, he has Brock Purdy long-term, love that. Shanahan, love that. But the offense is a little bit tricky. First of all, they drafted first-round rookie wide receiver Ricky Pearsall, who's looked pretty good in his limited opportunities since recovering from the attempted forever sleep. Then you also have George Kittle, Christian McCaffrey, at least for now, Deebo Samuel. So there are a lot of mouths to feed in this offense. So it makes his consistency a little bit tough, and it really lowers his maximum in terms of his ceiling. But he's also coming off a significant injury now. Will he look the same post-injury? And so that is the only reason he's in the 6th tier of wide receivers. He's a lot more talented than this, but what is it going to look like for him when he returns from injury? So with Brandon Aiyuk, he started off a little bit slow. He was the wide receiver 35 in his first 2 seasons, but then he was the wide receiver 15, 14 this past season, and then kind of fell off the map due to a couple of reasons. So he held out during the offseason. So I do think that played a factor in his slow start to the year. He only had one really good week this year, and then obviously he's injured now. So very concerning drop off in play, but I do think there are a couple factors to help contextualize that, along with the fact that they have a lot of players on their offense that are good. So in terms of his usage, he's generally the team's X wide receiver, asked to beat man coverage. He plays 19.6% of his snaps from the slot and 80.4% out wide. His yards per out run of 1.74 this season was 44th. His PFF receiving grade of 74.1 is 37th. His yards after catch per reception of 4.2 is tied for 46th. His 3 missed tackles forced are tied for 50th. His 4 contested catches are tied for 52nd. His 45 targets are tied for 53rd. His 25 receptions are tied for 67th. And his 374 receiving yards are tied for 56th. And he didn't record a touchdown in 7 games. So yeah, I do think that due to him not particularly necessarily being the number 1 target in any given week, in combination with the uncertainty of how he looks post-injury, is going to ding him just a little bit and put him in this tier of wide receivers. I really don't think that his value is ever going to increase too much, but I do think that he's a much better player than he showed at any point this season besides that one solid game. And so I do think he's going to rebound when he comes back. It's just, I don't think we see a wide receiver 15 or 14 finish from him probably for the rest of his career. The final wide receiver 24 overall, is Tyreek Hill. So he is probably one of the hardest players to rank because the past time we saw anything crazy from him was week 1 of this season. Then once Tua was out, he wasn't really, the whole offense really wasn't able to do much of anything. But then when Tua returned, we haven't really seen very much production from him. He had a fine week this past week. The other issue compounding that is that he's 30 years and 7 months old, so well past the age apex of 26. And so for that reason, we know that if you know anything about Tyreek Hill, you know that he's had consistently, you could argue Jamar Chase, but he's had reasonably the most upside at wide receiver, possibly Amari Cooper too. And so along with a really solid floor, and especially since he moved to Miami, he has been a consistent force. It's just, is he going to return to producing the way he did post or pre-Tua injury? Is he declining as a player, immensely to the point where he's not even going to be the same guy anymore? These are real questions that need answers, and they're going to be answers that are only going to be able to be had with time. So when we think about Tyreek Hill, he's been consistently one of the most dominant real life and fantasy assets possible. In 3 of the past 5 seasons, he's finished as the wide receiver 2, with the other being the wide receiver 6 before this season. So yeah, he's been consistently dominant. It's just the age. And then with him not really producing like he was previously, even as, like I said, since week 1, with Tua back, that definitely is concerning. I do think that he's going to return to much closer to what we used to see than what we've seen somewhat recently from him. I think the offense has just been in a little bit of a funk. And so I do think he's going to return to being a lot closer to what we previously saw than what we've seen post week 1. When we think about his usage, he's used 38.2% of the time from the slot and 60.9% out wide. His 1.6 yards per out run is tied for 40th. His 73.0 PFF receiving grade is 40th. His 4.4 yards after catch per reception is 41st. His 8 missed tackles forced is tied for 12th. His 6 contested catches are tied for 35th. His 67 targets are tied for 21st. His 44 receptions are tied for 21st. His 523 receiving yards are 28th. And his 3 receiving touchdowns are also tied for 33rd. And so, like I said, this definitely hasn't been the season that we were hoping for from him. I tried to trade for him in one league in the offseason, and I'm quite glad I wasn't able to get that done. But I do think that things are going to return. It's just, with him being almost 31 years old, at least closer to 31 than 30, with the decrease in total production, even with Tua back, he's probably not climbing much further up these rankings. And even if you have him ranked somewhere ahead of where I do, I think you'd be kidding yourself if you thought he was really going to increase too much in value. And so for all of these reasons, I do think that he's a solid bet to get a little bit better, at least in terms of his production for the rest of the season. But I really don't see his dynasty ranking going up much further due to his age. And so to review, wide receivers that I think are in the S tier, tier 1 of wide receivers, we have Ja'Marr Chase, Jay Jettas, CeeDee Lamb, Malik Nabers, ASRB, and Nico Collins. Wide receivers I consider just a step below, but very, very good ones. We have Drake London, MHJ, AJ Brown, Garrett Wilson, and Puka Nacua. Wide receivers in that third tier that I think have a ton of promise and will at the very least become tier 2 wide receivers in due time. And this is just my opinion. We have Brian Thomas Jr., Odunze, and Lad McConkey. And then wide receivers that I think are in that 4th tier, just a step below. We have Rashee Rice, Zay Flowers, JSN, George Pickens, and Jayden Reed. Then wide receivers that I would like to have a little bit higher up, but due to age are going to be a little bit suppressed. We have DeVonta Smith, DJ Moore, and DK Metcalf. And then wide receivers that I would have just a little step below them are Tyreek Hill and Brandon Aiyuk. All right. So who do you have a little bit higher in the rankings? Who do you have a little bit lower? Let me know below in the comment section. Remember that for the most part, I really prioritize age. I obviously prioritize ceiling. I like having a floor that's good and consistency. You like having long-term QB stability. You like the immense volume. And so there's a lot of factors that come into play here in terms of ranking the wide receivers, specifically tiering them out. And so I'm curious to see if you agree with some of these, disagree, and where that is the case. So please let me know below in the comment section and let me know why. With that being said, if you like what you've seen and heard in this video, feel free to like and subscribe. It's a free and easy way to support the channel, and I'd really appreciate it. Thanks.